Get him off this plane. He's been watching the cockpit, and I don't like the way he looks. Richard Cole's voice cut across the first-class cabin, sharp enough to silence every conversation within seconds. Malcolm Hayes slowly lifted his eyes from his phone. He was 47, dressed in a charcoal jacket, dark jeans, and clean black shoes, with nothing about him demanding attention except the calm in his face. 2 airport security officers waited in the aisle while Richard stood behind them, certain he had already decided what kind of man Malcolm was. "What exactly have I done?" Malcolm asked. His voice was quiet. Richard glanced toward the cockpit door. "You've been watching the crew, asking questions, looking around places that don't concern you." Malcolm studied him for a moment. "So looking is now a security violation?" A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Phones appeared above seatbacks. Lauren Whitmore, the lead flight attendant, folded her arms near the galley. "Sir, you're making people nervous." Malcolm looked around the cabin. Nobody had complained. Nobody had moved away from him. Yet somehow suspicion had already become evidence. "Which people?" he asked. Lauren said nothing. Richard stepped closer. "We're not debating this. Stand up and come with us." Malcolm remained seated for one measured second. Outside the window, morning light reflected across the wing of another Apex Meridian aircraft waiting at the neighboring gate. His eyes moved toward it, then toward a detail near the front section of his own aircraft that had caught his attention minutes earlier. Something the crew should have checked. Something he had quietly mentioned before Richard decided the real problem was him. "Before you remove me," Malcolm said, "you should check the maintenance log." Richard gave a humorless smile. "Security advice from you? That's enough." Malcolm's expression hardened, but his voice never rose. "You have no idea what you're ignoring. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Malcolm." Richard motioned toward the aisle. "Last chance. Walk off voluntarily." Malcolm stood slowly, not because Richard had intimidated him, but because he wanted every witness in that cabin to understand exactly what was happening. Naomi Bennett, a junior flight attendant standing near the galley, stared at Malcolm with growing uncertainty. She had seen that face somewhere before. A company meeting. An internal announcement. She couldn't place it yet. Richard could. He simply hadn't bothered to look. "He looks suspicious," Richard repeated, as though saying it twice could turn prejudice into procedure. Malcolm looked directly at him. "Then tell me what suspicious looks like." The cabin went still. Richard's confidence flickered for half a second. Malcolm turned his eyes toward the aircraft outside again. Same model, same fleet configuration, and possibly the same overlooked problem. Suddenly, what was happening inside this cabin felt much larger than one man's humiliation. Malcolm reached calmly for his phone. Richard immediately ordered him to put it away. Malcolm did, but not before seeing one message on the screen from Claire Donovan, the airline's chief operating officer. "Are you seeing what we think you're seeing?" Malcolm looked toward the cockpit one final time. The answer was yes. But Richard Cole was too busy deciding that a black man in first class looked dangerous to realize the man he was removing from the aircraft was Malcolm Hayes, CEO of Apex Meridian Airlines, and the only person in that cabin with the authority to stop every plane in the company from leaving the ground. 20 minutes earlier, Malcolm Hayes had stepped through the aircraft door without anyone turning twice to look at him. That was exactly how he wanted it. No tailored suit. No executive assistant walking 3 steps behind him. No company security detail clearing the aisle. Just a charcoal jacket over a plain black shirt, dark jeans, and a small leather carry-on that had traveled with him through more airports than he cared to count. He had boarded Apex Meridian Flight 417 like any other passenger, handed over his boarding pass, and waited for the scanner to flash green. Lauren Whitmore looked at the screen, then at Malcolm, then back at the screen. "First class?" she asked. Malcolm glanced at the seat number printed clearly on the pass. "Seat 2C. Lauren scanned it again. Green. The passenger behind Malcolm, a white businessman wearing a navy suit, presented his pass and received an immediate smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reynolds." Malcolm noticed the difference. He always noticed. He simply did not react to every insult people tried to disguise as routine. He walked to his seat and placed his bag carefully beneath the seat in front of him. This flight was supposed to be an unannounced operational review. For 3 months, Complaints had been reaching his office about inconsistent treatment, weak safety reporting, and employees who cared more about appearances than procedure. Malcolm wanted to see the airline without the performance employees gave whenever they knew the chief executive officer was watching. For the first few minutes, everything seemed ordinary. Then Malcolm noticed Lauren complete a pre-departure check near the forward galley. She moved quickly, too quickly. His attention shifted toward the cockpit entrance, then toward a maintenance indicator visible from his position when a crew member opened a service panel. Malcolm leaned slightly forward. He knew the fleet. He knew its systems. He had spent years insisting that executives understand the machines carrying their customers 30,000 feet above the ground. "Excuse me," he said when Lauren passed. "Was the forward system inspection signed off this morning?" Lauren stopped. Her expression changed immediately. "That is a crew matter. I understand. I am asking whether it was checked." She looked him over again, slower this time. "Why are you asking questions about the aircraft?" Malcolm nodded toward the panel. "Because something does not look right." Lauren stared at him as though the question itself had crossed a boundary. "Passengers are not permitted to interfere with flight operations." "I am not interfering. I am pointing something out." Across the aisle, Naomi Bennett heard the exchange. She glanced toward the same panel, then toward Malcolm. There was something familiar about him, something buried in a memory from an internal company broadcast months earlier. Before she could place it, Lauren walked into the galley and lowered her voice to another crew member. Malcolm could not hear every word, but he heard enough. Watching the cockpit, asking technical questions, suspicious behavior. Within minutes, Richard Cole appeared at the aircraft door. He did not examine the panel. He did not ask Lauren whether Malcolm had threatened anyone. He walked directly toward seat 2C and looked down at the black man sitting there. "I hear you have been monitoring the cockpit," Richard said. Malcolm met his eyes. "I reported a possible maintenance concern." Richard ignored the distinction. Why would a passenger know anything about that? Malcolm looked past him toward the window. At the neighboring gate sat another Apex Meridian aircraft of the same configuration. His eyes narrowed. The same detail was visible there too. One aircraft could mean an isolated oversight. Two could mean something else entirely. Malcolm turned back to Richard. "Before you decide I am the problem," he said quietly, "you might want to find out why two of your airplanes appear to have the same one." Richard Cole followed Malcolm's gaze toward the neighboring aircraft, but only for a second. Curiosity never reached his face. He had already chosen the explanation he preferred. "I asked why you were watching the cockpit," Richard said. Malcolm remained seated. "And I answered you. I noticed a possible maintenance issue." "You expect me to believe that?" "Belief has nothing to do with it. Check the maintenance log." Lauren Whitmore stood behind Richard with her arms folded, her expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed authority had arrived to confirm her judgment. "He has been questioning crew procedures since he boarded," she said. "He keeps watching restricted areas." Malcolm turned toward her. "I looked through an open cockpit door and asked one question about a visible indicator. That is not a security threat." Richard leaned slightly closer. "Most passengers do not study airplanes that carefully. Most passengers do not spend 20 years in aviation." That answer should have created a question. Instead, it created more suspicion. Richard looked at Malcolm's simple clothes, then at the leather carry-on beneath the seat, as if searching for evidence in everything except the facts. "What exactly do you do in aviation?" he asked. Malcolm held his gaze. "Right now, I am a passenger telling you to check an aircraft before you put more than 100 people in the air." A murmur moved through the nearby rows. Lauren immediately looked toward the passengers. "There is no safety concern. Everything is under control." Malcolm's eyes sharpened. "You do not know that because you have not checked." Naomi Bennett stood near the forward galley, watching the exchange grow colder by the second. She looked toward the service panel Malcolm had mentioned. Then she remembered something from a safety briefing 2 weeks earlier, a notice about a recurring inspection requirement across several aircraft in the fleet. She took one step toward Lauren. "Maybe we should contact maintenance just to confirm." Lauren turned sharply. "Naomi, return to your duties." "But if he noticed something relevant," I said, "return to your duties." Naomi stopped, but she did not look away. Richard noticed passengers beginning to pay attention and lowered his voice, though the contempt remained. "Let us make this simple. Show me identification." Malcolm reached into his jacket and handed over his driver's license. Richard studied it. Malcolm Hayes. The name meant nothing to him. That failure belonged entirely to Richard. And your reason for traveling? He asked. Malcolm almost smiled. Since when does a first-class passenger need to explain why he is traveling? Since that passenger starts monitoring flight operations. Across the aisle, a woman lowered her book. A man near the window removed one earbud. The cabin was no longer relaxed. Suspicion had entered the room, but it was no longer pointed only at Malcolm. People were beginning to question Richard. Malcolm extended his hand for his identification. Richard returned it reluctantly. Now check the log, Malcolm said. Lauren exhaled impatiently. We are not delaying a flight because one passenger thinks he saw something. Malcolm looked toward the neighboring aircraft again. Then you may be making the same mistake twice. Richard's expression hardened. That sounds like a threat. Malcolm slowly turned back to him. No. It sounds like a warning you are determined not to hear. Naomi stared at Malcolm's face again, searching her memory. Then it came closer. A company leadership broadcast. A photograph beside a message about accountability. She could almost see the name beneath it. Before she could speak, Richard reached for his radio. I need additional security at gate 14, he said. We have a passenger displaying suspicious behavior and refusing to cooperate. Malcolm sat perfectly still. He had answered every question. He had shown identification. He had pointed out a possible safety problem. Yet with one sentence, Richard had transformed caution into guilt. Malcolm looked at him with a calm that made Richard visibly uncomfortable. You have not checked the maintenance log, Malcolm said. You have not inspected what I showed you. You have not asked why I recognized it. You looked at me and decided suspicion was easier than investigation. Richard said nothing. Then Naomi's eyes widened. The memory finally locked into place. She knew exactly where she had seen Malcolm Hayes before. Naomi Bennett knew the face now. She had seen Malcolm Hayes 6 months earlier during a company-wide leadership broadcast, standing before thousands of employees and speaking about one principle he repeated until it became impossible to forget. Safety without accountability was only a slogan. The man sitting in seat 2C was that man, her chief executive officer. Naomi opened her mouth, but Richard Cole was already speaking into his radio, requesting additional security as though Malcolm had become more dangerous simply because nobody had listened to him. Richard, Naomi said carefully. He lowered the radio and looked at her. What? She glanced at Malcolm, then at Lauren Whitmore. I think we need to verify his identity through the company directory. Lauren gave an impatient laugh. We already checked his identification. That is not what I mean. Malcolm watched Naomi without helping her. He could have ended the confrontation with 4 words. I run this company. But that would have answered the wrong question. The real question was how these employees treated someone they believed had no power. Richard stepped between Naomi and Malcolm. This is a security matter now. Naomi's voice remained steady. Then security should be interested in facts. A few passengers nodded. Richard noticed. His jaw tightened. Malcolm turned toward the window again. The aircraft at the neighboring gate was being prepared for departure. A ground crew member moved beneath its forward section, completed a visual walk-around, and continued without stopping. Malcolm's concern deepened. The similarity was no longer easy to dismiss. He looked toward Naomi. Do you remember the fleet inspection notice issued 2 weeks ago? Naomi hesitated. The forward monitoring system bulletin? Lauren's expression changed. That bulletin was handled. Malcolm looked at her. Was it? Silence followed. Naomi stepped toward the service panel and studied the indicator from a respectful distance. She did not touch anything. I remember maintenance was supposed to confirm the inspection in the aircraft log. Malcolm nodded once. Exactly. Richard raised a hand. Enough. Nobody is turning this cabin into a maintenance conference because a passenger wants attention. Malcolm's eyes settled on him. You keep calling me a passenger as if that makes the warning less important. It makes you someone without authority here. Naomi almost spoke again, but Malcolm gave her the slightest look. Wait. He wanted Richard to reveal the full shape of his judgment without being rescued by a title. Outside, a baggage cart rolled past the neighboring aircraft. Beyond it, another Apex Meridian jet waited several gates away. Same aircraft family. Same maintenance program. Malcolm felt the pieces beginning to connect. If the inspection had been recorded incorrectly across multiple aircraft, the problem was no longer one flight. Naomi, Malcolm asked, when was the bulletin closed? She thought carefully. Yesterday morning, according to the internal update. Across the fleet? That was my understanding. Malcolm looked back through the window. Richard followed his gaze again, irritated now. What are you looking for? Malcolm answered without turning. A pattern. Lauren shook her head. This is ridiculous. Naomi looked at her. What if it is not? That question landed harder than anyone expected. Richard's radio suddenly answered with confirmation that additional security was approaching the aircraft. He straightened, relieved to feel control returning. Malcolm finally looked at him again. You still have time to check the log. Richard shook his head. We are checking you. Naomi's face tightened. She had watched Malcolm point to evidence, ask for verification, and remain calm through every accusation. Yet Richard had investigated everything except the warning itself. Then Naomi remembered one more detail from the maintenance bulletin, something small enough to be overlooked and serious enough to change everything. She turned toward Malcolm, her voice suddenly quiet. Mr. Hayes, if that indicator is showing what I think it is, this aircraft is not the only one we need to check. Richard froze at the name. Lauren looked from Naomi to Malcolm, and for the first time, uncertainty entered the cabin before the additional security officers even reached the door. Richard Cole stared at Naomi as if she had broken an unwritten rule. Mr. Hayes, he repeated. Naomi held his gaze. That is his name. Richard looked down at Malcolm again, but recognition still did not arrive. Pride stood in the way. Lauren Whitmore stepped closer and lowered her voice. Naomi, stop encouraging him. You are making this worse. I am asking us to verify what he said. And I am telling you that people like him make everyone nervous when they start asking questions they should not be asking. The sentence landed across the cabin like something dropped on glass. Nobody moved. Malcolm slowly turned toward Lauren. His face remained composed, but something colder entered his eyes. People like me? Lauren immediately realized how the word sounded. That is not what I meant. Then explain what you meant. She opened her mouth, but Richard interrupted. We are not doing this. Malcolm looked at him. No. You started this. Now let her finish. Richard stepped forward. Open your bag. Malcolm did not move. On what grounds? Security procedure. Which procedure? Richard's expression tightened. The one that applies when someone displays suspicious behavior. Malcolm glanced around the cabin. I boarded with a valid ticket. I sat in my assigned seat. I asked about a maintenance indicator. I provided identification. Which part was suspicious? Richard had no answer that could survive being spoken aloud. Lauren pointed toward Malcolm's carry-on. If you have nothing to hide, opening it should not be a problem. Malcolm looked at her for a long moment. That sentence has excused a great deal of bad judgment in this country. Several passengers murmured in agreement. Richard reached for the carry-on, but Malcolm calmly placed one hand on the handle first. You may inspect it when you provide a legitimate reason. The additional security officers arrived at the aircraft door. Among them was Ethan Brooks, a younger officer whose eyes immediately moved from Malcolm to Richard and then to the growing audience of passengers. What happened? Ethan asked. Richard answered quickly. Possible security concern. He has been monitoring the cockpit and questioning flight systems. Ethan looked at Malcolm. Did he attempt to enter a restricted area? No. Did he threaten anyone? Richard hesitated. Not directly. Did he refuse identification? No. The silence after that answer was brutal. Ethan looked toward Lauren. Then what started this? Lauren folded her arms. He was acting suspicious. Malcolm finally released the handle of his bag and opened it himself. Inside were a laptop, a notebook, and a slim folder bearing the Apex Meridian corporate seal. Richard picked up the folder and studied it. Malcolm Hayes. Executive Operations Review. His expression shifted, but only slightly. Anyone could print this. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. Richard, you cannot be serious. Lauren looked inside the bag and noticed a black executive access card. That could be fake too. Malcolm gave a quiet nod, almost as if they had confirmed something he already knew. You have rejected my ticket, my identification, my knowledge, and now your own company credentials. At what point do you admit that evidence was never what you were looking for? Ethan glanced at Richard, visibly uncomfortable. Richard ignored him. People are nervous because of your behavior. Malcolm looked across the cabin, then asked them. A woman in row 3 spoke immediately. I was not nervous until security arrived. Another passenger added. Neither was I. Richard's face hardened as control slipped away from him. Malcolm looked toward the neighboring aircraft again. Time was moving. If his suspicion about the maintenance records was correct, every minute mattered. Check the log, he said once more. Richard shook his head. You are coming off this aircraft. Malcolm rose slowly from his seat. Naomi stepped forward. Richard, do not do this. Richard pointed toward the door. Malcolm stood perfectly still, surrounded by people who had finally begun to understand that the danger in the cabin had never been the quiet black man asking a question. Then Malcolm looked directly at Richard and said, If you remove me before checking that maintenance record, you may discover that the person you should have been suspicious of was the one who told you everything was fine. Richard Cole held Malcolm's gaze for a moment, then turned toward Ethan Brooks. Escort him off. Ethan did not move. I want to confirm the incident first. Richard's voice sharpened. I am the regional security director. I have already confirmed it. Ethan looked toward Malcolm, then toward the passengers watching from every row. With respect, all I have heard is that he asked about a maintenance issue. Lauren Whitmore stepped forward. He has disrupted boarding, questioned the crew, and refused to cooperate. I answered every question you asked, Malcolm said. His voice remained level. You simply did not like the answers. A man seated across the aisle raised his hand slightly. He is telling the truth. I have been sitting here the entire time. A woman behind him spoke next. So have I. He never caused a problem. Richard looked around the cabin as though the witnesses themselves had become inconvenient. Everyone remained seated. This is an active security matter. Malcolm studied him carefully. Security requires evidence, Richard. Fear only requires an excuse. Naomi Bennett stepped beside the forward galley. Her nervousness had not disappeared, but something stronger had replaced it. I checked the passenger record, she said. Lauren turned toward her. You did what? His boarding pass is valid. His identification matches. His reservation was booked through an executive account. Richard's expression tightened. That proves nothing about his behavior. Naomi continued. There is more. The executive credential in his bag matches the format used by corporate leadership. Lauren shook her head. You cannot verify that from here. Then let us call corporate security. Richard immediately answered, No. That single word changed the air. Ethan looked at him. Malcolm noticed it too. Richard was no longer trying to discover the truth. He was trying to prevent the truth from arriving before he could remove the person challenging him. Malcolm turned toward the cockpit. Call maintenance instead. Lauren sighed. We are already behind schedule. Then be 5 minutes later instead of 30,000 feet too late. The cabin went silent again. Richard pointed toward the aircraft door. That is enough. You are leaving. Malcolm remained where he stood. I will walk off this aircraft if you give me one reason based on something I actually did. Richard stepped closer. You made the crew uncomfortable. Malcolm looked around at the passengers. No. I made you uncomfortable because I knew something you did not expect me to know. Ethan lowered his voice. Richard, we should verify the maintenance concern. It will take a few minutes. Richard turned on him. Your job is to follow instructions. Ethan did not look away. My job is also to prevent unnecessary escalation. Naomi nodded. And mine is to protect passengers. If there is even a possibility that the inspection was missed, we need to check. Lauren stared at her. You are risking your job over a stranger. Naomi looked at Malcolm, then back at Lauren. No, I am risking it over the truth. The words moved through the cabin like electricity. Malcolm said nothing. He did not need to. Richard reached for his radio again. Gate operations. Prepare to remove one passenger from flight 417. Ethan's face fell. Naomi stepped forward. He has done nothing. Richard ignored her. Malcolm slowly picked up his carry-on. The passengers watched, some angry, others stunned. Listen carefully, Malcolm said. If I leave this aircraft, this flight should remain exactly where it is until that log is checked. Richard gave a cold smile. You do not decide whether this aircraft flies. Malcolm looked at him with absolute calm. You are right. One aircraft is not the decision I am worried about. Richard frowned. Malcolm glanced through the window at the other Apex Meridian jets waiting across the terminal. Then he looked back at Ethan. When this is over, remember that you asked for facts before following an order. That will matter. Ethan stared at him, confused by the certainty in his voice. Richard pointed toward the door again. Malcolm began walking down the aisle on his own, each step quiet, controlled, witnessed. Behind him, Naomi reached for the internal company directory on her tablet. She entered his full name. The screen loaded. Her face went still. At the top of the profile appeared Malcolm Hayes, Chief Executive Officer. Naomi looked toward the open aircraft door and whispered, "Oh my God." But Richard had already followed Malcolm onto the jet bridge, still believing he was removing a problem instead of creating one. The jet bridge door closed behind Malcolm Hayes with a heavy click, separating him from the cabin full of witnesses who had just watched suspicion become policy. Richard Cole followed a few steps behind, still carrying himself like a man who believed the situation was under control. Two security officers waited near the gate entrance. Malcolm stopped halfway down the corridor and turned. "Am I being detained?" Richard hesitated. "You are being removed from the flight, pending further review." "For what specific violation?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "Your behavior raised legitimate security concerns." Malcolm gave him one final opportunity. "Name the behavior." Richard said nothing. Behind the closed aircraft door, Naomi Bennett hurried toward Lauren Whitmore with the company directory still open on her tablet. "You need to see this." Lauren barely looked. "Not now." Naomi stepped directly into her path. "Yes, right now." She turned the screen toward her. Malcolm's corporate photograph appeared beside his full name and title. Lauren's face lost its certainty. "That cannot be him." "It is him." Ethan Brooks leaned closer and read the profile. His expression changed instantly. "Chief Executive Officer?" Naomi nodded. "And his executive credential was real." Lauren stared toward the aircraft door. For several seconds, she could not speak. Then she whispered, "Richard does not know." Ethan reached for his radio. "Then somebody needs to tell him before this gets worse." Lauren caught his attention. "Wait." Ethan looked at her in disbelief. "Wait for what?" Outside on the jet bridge, Richard was still explaining Malcolm to the other officers as though Malcolm were not standing 6 feet away. He was watching the cockpit, questioning systems, making the crew uncomfortable. One officer asked, "Did he attempt to enter the cockpit?" Richard answered, "No." "Did he make a threat?" "Not exactly." Malcolm listened quietly. Each answer weakened the accusation, but Richard continued building it anyway. Finally, Malcolm spoke. "You saw a black man paying attention, and you decided attention was dangerous." Richard turned sharply. "Do not make this about race." Malcolm's expression did not change. "You made it about race before I ever said the word." The gate area beyond the jet bridge had begun to fill with curious travelers. Some passengers near the windows could see the confrontation through the glass. A gate agent approached, confused. "Is there a problem with Flight 417? Malcolm answered before Richard could. "There may be a maintenance issue that needs immediate verification." Richard interrupted. "There is no confirmed maintenance issue." Malcolm looked at him. "Because you still have not checked." At that moment, the aircraft door opened behind them. Ethan stepped onto the jet bridge, moving quickly but calmly. "Richard, I need to speak with you." Richard did not turn. "Not now. It cannot wait." Naomi appeared behind Ethan, holding the tablet. Richard finally looked back. "What is this?" Naomi walked closer, her face pale but determined. "You need to verify his identity." Richard glanced at Malcolm, then at the screen she held out. His eyes moved across the photograph, the name, and the title. For the first time since entering the aircraft, Richard had no words. Malcolm watched recognition arrive slowly, followed by disbelief, then fear. Lauren remained near the aircraft door, frozen. Richard looked back at Malcolm. "Mr. Hayes, I did not realize." Malcolm raised one hand. "Do not finish that sentence." The gate area fell quiet. "If knowing my title changes how you believe I should have been treated, then you still do not understand what you did." Richard swallowed. "This was a misunderstanding." "No," Malcolm said. "A misunderstanding ends when facts arrive. You rejected every fact because none of them matched the person you had already decided I was." Then Malcolm's phone vibrated. He looked down. A message from Claire Donovan filled the screen. "Preliminary review confirms a possible fleet-wide inspection discrepancy. Awaiting your authorization." Malcolm lifted his eyes toward the windows, where several Apex Meridian aircraft sat beneath the morning sun, preparing to carry thousands of passengers across the country. Richard thought the worst revelation had already happened. He thought discovering Malcolm's identity was the moment everything changed. He was wrong. Malcolm slipped the phone back into his hand and looked directly at Naomi. "How many aircraft were cleared under yesterday's inspection update?" Naomi hesitated. "The entire active fleet." Malcolm's face became still. Richard stared at him. "What does that mean?" Malcolm looked through the glass at the aircraft waiting beyond the terminal. It means nobody leaves the ground until I know exactly what your people failed to see. For a moment, Malcolm Hayes did not move. The terminal lights reflected across the glass beside him, turning the parked aircraft outside into pale shapes against the morning sky. Richard Cole was speaking, Naomi Bennett was answering someone behind him, and Ethan Brooks was requesting that gate operations hold Flight 417. But their voices seemed to fade beneath a memory Malcolm had carried for 30 years. He was 17 again, standing beside his father at an airport security checkpoint in Atlanta. It was Malcolm's first flight alone. He had worn a button-down shirt his mother had pressed the night before and carried a small suitcase his father had bought for him after saving for months. The line moved quickly until Malcolm reached the front. Then everything slowed. An officer looked at his identification, looked at his face, and asked him to step aside. Malcolm remembered watching other travelers continue toward their gates while questions came one after another. Where was he going? Why was he traveling alone? Who had paid for his ticket? His father stood beyond the barrier, unable to come closer, but Malcolm could still see his eyes. There was anger in them, but also something steadier. When Malcolm was finally cleared, his father waited until they were alone and placed a hand on his shoulder. Never let another person's suspicion decide your worth, he had said. But never confuse staying calm with staying silent when something matters. Malcolm had carried those words through college, through his first job in aviation, through boardrooms where people assumed he was an assistant before realizing he was leading the meeting. He carried them when investors questioned whether customers would trust a young black executive. He carried them when he became chief executive officer of Apex Meridian Airlines and promised himself that safety would never depend on status, appearance, or who had the loudest voice in the room. Now, standing on the jet bridge outside one of his own aircraft, he understood the full weight of what had happened. Richard had not merely doubted him. Lauren had not merely dismissed a passenger. They had allowed prejudice to become a filter through which information was judged. Because the warning came from someone they had already decided looked suspicious, they treated the warning itself as suspicious. Malcolm looked toward Flight 417. The anger inside him was real, but it was quiet now. Focused. Useful. Mr. Hayes, Richard said carefully, I want to apologize for how this was handled. Malcolm turned toward him. You still think this is about me? Richard looked confused. Malcolm continued. If I had been wrong about the aircraft, what happened in that cabin would still require an investigation. But if I am right, then your assumptions did something more dangerous. They taught you to ignore information because you did not respect the person giving it. Naomi lowered her tablet. Ethan stood silently beside her. Lauren remained near the aircraft door, her earlier confidence gone. Malcolm's phone vibrated again. Claire Donovan was calling. He answered. Claire. Her voice was immediate. The preliminary audit found inconsistencies in the inspection records. We are checking how many aircraft are affected. Malcolm looked through the terminal windows. One Apex Meridian jet was taxiing slowly away from a distant gate. Another was preparing to push back. Stop departures from this airport, he said. Claire paused. Immediately. Hold every Apex Meridian aircraft here until we know more. Richard stared at him. Malcolm's eyes remained fixed on the moving aircraft outside. And Claire, prepare the system-wide protocol. The jet bridge became completely silent. Are you certain? She asked. Malcolm thought of his father. He thought of the 17-year-old boy who had learned what it felt like to be treated as suspicious before being treated as human. Then he thought of thousands of passengers trusting his company to make the right decision before certainty became regret. His voice was calm when he answered. I have never been more certain. Get the operations team ready. If this discrepancy reaches beyond this airport, we ground every aircraft necessary until every inspection is verified. Claire Donovan did not ask Malcolm Hayes to repeat himself. She had worked beside him long enough to recognize the difference between concern and command. Understood, she said. I am opening the emergency operations channel now. Malcolm watched the Apex Meridian aircraft in the distance slow before reaching the taxiway. A moment later, another jet remained parked at its gate when it should have begun pushing back. The airport itself had not changed, but something invisible had moved through the system. Richard Cole noticed it too. You cannot stop an entire operation over one indicator, he said. Malcolm turned toward him. You still think this is about one indicator? His phone vibrated again as Claire connected the senior operations team. Voices entered the call from maintenance control, flight operations, network planning, and corporate safety. Malcolm listened without interruption as the first findings came in. 3 aircraft at this airport showed inspection records completed within identical time windows. 2 had conflicting maintenance entries. Another had been cleared without the expected secondary verification. The pattern was forming faster than anyone wanted. How many aircraft used the same inspection process? Malcolm asked. A maintenance executive answered carefully. Potentially the entire active fleet, depending on when the documentation error began. Malcolm looked through the glass at the Apex Meridian logo painted across one aircraft tail after another. Thousands of passengers, hundreds of crews, dozens of cities. One unchecked assumption could travel farther than any airplane. Claire, he said, initiate black ground. Silence filled the call for half a second. Black ground was the company's highest internal operational hold, designed to stop departures across the network while an urgent safety concern was investigated. It had never been activated company-wide. Confirming system-wide. Claire asked. System-wide. Richard stared at Malcolm. Lauren Whitmore stepped out from the aircraft doorway, her face pale. Naomi Bennett stood beside Ethan Brooks, both watching the departure board above the gate. Flight 417 changed first. Delayed. Then another Apex Meridian flight changed. Then another. Across the board, departure times disappeared and operational holds replaced them. Phones began ringing behind the gate desk. Crew tablets lit up with urgent notices. Pilots, already preparing for departure, received instructions to remain at their gates. Aircraft moving toward taxiways were directed into approved holding positions or returned according to airport procedures. Malcolm's voice remained calm. No aircraft departs until maintenance confirms every required inspection. No exceptions for schedule pressure. No exceptions for executive travel. No exceptions for me. Claire answered, confirmed. Richard looked around as the consequences spread beyond the small confrontation he had started. Mr. Hayes, with respect, grounding the network will cost millions. Malcolm looked at him. Then we lose millions. Richard blinked. You would do that without knowing there is an actual defect. I know there is a verification failure. That is enough to stop and check. Malcolm stepped toward the terminal windows. An airline does not earn trust by pretending uncertainty does not exist. It earns trust by refusing to gamble with people who cannot see the decisions being made for them. Naomi's tablet sounded with an incoming internal alert. She read it aloud. All Apex Meridian departures placed on immediate operational hold pending fleet-wide safety verification. Lauren lowered her eyes. Richard said nothing. The same man they had treated as a threat minutes earlier had just accepted a financial loss larger than most people could imagine because someone might have overlooked a safety procedure. Malcolm's phone rang again. Claire's voice returned, tighter this time. Malcolm, maintenance found something else. The inspection discrepancy was reported yesterday. His expression changed. Reported by whom? A junior technician. The report was closed without escalation. Malcolm looked slowly toward Richard, then Lauren. The pattern had just become darker. Someone else had spoken before Malcolm. Someone else had warned them. And somewhere inside Apex Meridian, another voice had already been dismissed. Malcolm Hayes did not respond immediately. Around him, the terminal had transformed into a network of ringing phones, urgent conversations, and departure screens filling with delays, but his attention narrowed to one sentence. The discrepancy had been reported yesterday. Send me the report, he said. Claire Donovan forwarded it within seconds. Malcolm opened the document on his phone and read the name at the bottom. Daniel Price, junior maintenance technician, 26 years old, 11 months with Apex Meridian. His report had identified inconsistent verification records across several aircraft and requested an immediate secondary review. The request had been marked resolved less than 40 minutes later without supporting inspection documentation. Malcolm looked at the name of the supervisor who had closed it. Claire, suspend access for everyone who touched this report after Daniel submitted it. Preserve every message, timestamp, and maintenance record. Nobody deletes anything. Already in progress, Claire replied. Richard Cole shifted beside him. What does a maintenance report have to do with what happened here? Malcolm slowly lowered the phone. Everything. Richard frowned. I do not understand. That is the problem. Malcolm turned so everyone near the gate could hear him. A junior technician saw something that did not look right. He reported it. Someone with more authority decided his concern was inconvenient and closed it. I saw something that did not look right. I reported it. You decided I looked inconvenient and tried to remove me. Different departments. Same failure. Naomi Bennett stared at him, understanding spreading across her face. Ethan Brooks looked toward Richard. Lauren Whitmore stood near the aircraft door, silent now. Malcolm continued. When an organization starts judging the messenger before examining the message, safety becomes dependent on status. That ends today. Claire's voice came through the phone again. Malcolm, the board is joining the emergency call. They want confirmation directly from you. Malcolm activated the speaker. Claire's voice carried clearly across the gate area. Mr. Hayes, the entire active fleet is holding as ordered. No Apex Meridian aircraft will depart until you authorize release. Travelers nearby turned toward Malcolm. Gate agents stopped speaking. Richard's face tightened as the scale of Malcolm's authority became impossible to deny. Naomi had already known. Now everyone else did too. Malcolm Hayes was not an executive with an impressive title printed on a card. He was the chief executive officer whose decision had just stopped an entire airline. Richard stepped closer. Mr. Hayes, if I had known who you were, none of this would have happened. Malcolm looked at him with quiet disappointment. Then you have just admitted exactly why it happened. Richard froze. You should not need to recognize a chief executive officer before offering someone basic dignity. You should not need to know a person has power before listening when they speak. Lauren finally found her voice. We thought we were protecting the flight. Malcolm turned toward her. You protected your assumptions. When I asked you to check the aircraft, you checked me instead. No one answered. Then Claire interrupted with another update. We have preliminary confirmation from maintenance control. The indicator you noticed was connected to the same inspection sequence Daniel questioned yesterday. We are expanding physical verification across the fleet. Malcolm closed his eyes for one brief second. The decision to stop departures had been correct. When he opened them again, Richard looked smaller than he had inside the cabin. So you grounded every aircraft because of us? Richard asked. Malcolm shook his head. No, do not give yourself that much importance. His voice remained calm, but every word carried across the silent gate. I stopped those aircraft because prejudice made you ignore a warning, and somewhere else in this company, arrogance may have done the same thing to someone without my title. His phone vibrated again. Claire spoke before Malcolm could ask. We found Daniel Price. He is still on duty at the maintenance facility. Malcolm looked through the terminal windows at the silent aircraft lined across the field. Bring him into the emergency call, he said. This time, when he speaks, everyone listens. Daniel Price joined the emergency call from a quiet maintenance office on the other side of the airport. His voice carried the uncertainty of someone who had spent the last 24 hours wondering whether speaking up had been a mistake. Mr. Hayes, I did not expect to be talking to you. Malcolm stood near the terminal windows, watching the motionless Apex Meridian aircraft beyond the glass. You should have been talking to someone yesterday, Daniel. Tell us exactly what you found. Daniel took a breath. I was reviewing inspection records after a routine shift change. Several aircraft showed the same completion time for a secondary verification that should have been performed individually. I thought it could be a documentation error, so I checked additional records. The pattern continued. Claire Donovan spoke next. How many aircraft did you identify? 7 before I submitted the report. Malcolm's expression remained still. And what happened after you submitted it? Daniel hesitated. My supervisor told me the system had automatically duplicated timestamps. I asked for physical confirmation, but he said operations was under schedule pressure and the issue had already been reviewed. Was it? Malcolm asked. Not that I could verify. Silence spread across the call. Richard Cole looked toward the floor. Lauren Whitmore folded her hands tightly in front of her. Naomi Bennett and Ethan Brooks remained nearby, listening. Malcolm asked one more question. Why did you not escalate again? Daniel's answer came quietly. I am still new. I was told I needed to learn when to stop questioning people with more experience. Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment. There it was again. The same pattern wearing a different uniform. Authority deciding whose voice deserved weight. Daniel, you did your job, Malcolm said. The company failed to do its job after you spoke. Claire interrupted with an update from maintenance control. Physical inspections had begun across multiple airports. Several records contained administrative inconsistencies, but no immediate mechanical failure had been confirmed. Malcolm felt no relief yet. Verification mattered more than reassurance. "Keep every aircraft on hold," he said. "We release them individually only after each required inspection is physically confirmed and documented by 2 qualified teams." A board member on the call warned that cancellations could cost the airline tens of millions of dollars. Malcolm did not hesitate. Then, that is the price of finding the truth before passengers pay a higher one. Richard finally spoke. "Mr. Hayes, I understand why you are investigating maintenance, but I still believe my team acted out of caution." Malcolm turned toward him. "Caution checks evidence. Bias decides the answer first." Richard's face tightened. Malcolm continued. "You had my valid ticket. You had my identification. You had witnesses. You had an employee asking you to verify the facts. You ignored all of it because suspicion felt more comfortable than admitting you might be wrong." Lauren lowered her eyes. Naomi stood straighter. Malcolm looked at both of them. This is why the 2 failures are connected. Daniel was dismissed because someone believed his position was too junior to challenge authority. I was dismissed because you believed someone who looked like me could not possibly know more than you. In both cases, the warning became invisible because the person delivering it did not fit someone else's idea of importance. Claire's voice returned. "Malcolm, the first inspection teams are reporting. The issue appears to be a fleet-wide verification failure rather than a confirmed mechanical defect, but several aircraft require additional review before release." Malcolm nodded. "Then they stay grounded." Richard looked toward the departure board filled with delays. "People will say you shut down the airline because of what happened to you." Malcolm looked directly at him. "Then they will be wrong. You humiliated one man. That requires accountability. But your prejudice made you ignore a safety warning. That requires change." His phone sounded again. Claire had sent the first list of employees connected to the ignored report and the incident aboard Flight 417. Malcolm read the names carefully. Then he looked toward Richard and Lauren. The investigation was no longer approaching. It had arrived. Malcolm Hayes read the names on the report twice before locking his phone. Richard Cole stood only a few feet away, but the authority he had carried onto Flight 417 was gone. Lauren Whitmore remained near the gate entrance, silent beneath the eyes of passengers and employees who now understood exactly what had happened. Malcolm did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Richard, effective immediately, you are suspended from all security duties pending an independent investigation." Richard's face tightened. "Mr. Hayes, I have served this company for 12 years. Then you had 12 years to understand the difference between evidence and assumption." Richard tried to respond, but Malcolm continued. "Your system access will be restricted. You will have no contact with witnesses and no involvement in reviewing your own conduct." Claire Donovan confirmed the action through the phone. Richard's company device sounded seconds later with the official notice. Malcolm turned toward Lauren. "You are removed from flight duty pending investigation as well." Lauren looked stunned. "I made a mistake." Malcolm held her gaze. "A mistake is scanning the wrong boarding pass. You were given repeated opportunities to verify the facts. Instead, you described a black passenger as suspicious, dismissed a maintenance concern, and supported removing him because his questions made you uncomfortable." Lauren's voice weakened. "I never intended for any of this to happen. Intent does not erase consequence." The terminal fell quiet around them. Malcolm then looked toward Ethan Brooks. "You questioned an order when the facts did not support it. That is what professional judgment is supposed to look like." Ethan nodded slowly. "I should have pushed harder." "Then remember that feeling the next time authority asks you to ignore what you know is right." Malcolm turned to Naomi Bennett. "And you spoke when staying silent would have protected your position." Naomi looked toward the aircraft. "I almost stayed quiet. But you did not." Malcolm shifted his attention back to Claire. "I want an independent review of every discrimination complaint involving airport security and cabin operations from the last 5 years. I want the maintenance escalation system audited. Anonymous safety reports go directly to an independent review team from now on. No supervisor gets to bury a warning because a delay is inconvenient." Claire answered immediately. "Understood." Richard shook his head. "You are restructuring the company because of one incident." Malcolm looked at him. "No. One incident exposed a structure that was already failing." Richard's expression hardened with frustration. "If I had known who you were, I would have handled it differently. Malcolm's face became completely still. That is exactly the problem. Every nearby conversation stopped. You keep offering that sentence as an apology, but it is a confession. The man in seat 2C deserved dignity before you knew his title. The maintenance technician deserved to be heard before anyone knew whether his warning would become important. Respect that depends on power is not respect. It is fear. Richard had nothing left to say. Two corporate security representatives arrived at the gate, not to remove Malcolm, but to collect Richard's credentials and escort him from the restricted operations area. Lauren was directed to report to employee relations. No spectacle followed. No celebration. Just consequences moving quietly into place. Then Claire's voice returned through Malcolm's phone. The first group of aircraft has passed physical verification. We can begin controlled releases. Malcolm looked toward the departure board. Only after dual confirmation. Already implemented. He nodded. Outside, the aircraft remained still beneath the bright morning sky, waiting for facts instead of assumptions. Naomi stepped beside Malcolm. What happens now? He watched a maintenance team working around Flight 417. Now we fix what should have been fixed before today. His phone vibrated with another update. Daniel Price had been formally assigned to the independent safety review team, and his original report had been restored to the official record. Malcolm read the message, then looked across the terminal. The airline would fly again, but not as the same company that had landed that morning. Nearly 6 hours after Flight 417 was placed on hold, the first verified Apex Meridian aircraft received clearance to depart. Then another followed. Across the country, maintenance teams completed physical inspections, independent supervisors confirmed every required record, and aircraft returned to service one by one. There had been no catastrophic mechanical failure, but the audit had uncovered something Malcolm Hayes considered dangerous enough on its own. A culture that had allowed verification to become a box to check instead of a responsibility to honor. The delays had cost the company millions of dollars. Malcolm accepted every dollar of it. By late afternoon, Flight 417 was finally cleared. The same aircraft that had become the center of the morning's confrontation now waited quietly at the gate, inspected, documented, and verified by two separate maintenance teams. Malcolm stood before the open aircraft door with his carry-on beside him. Naomi Bennett approached from the cabin. Everything has been confirmed, she said. Twice. Malcolm gave a small nod. That is how it should have been the first time. Ethan Brooks stood near the gate desk, finishing his statement for the independent investigation. Daniel Price had already joined the emergency safety review from the maintenance facility, where senior executives who had ignored his name yesterday were now listening to every word he said. Richard Cole was gone from the restricted area. Lauren Whitmore had been removed from duty pending review. But Malcolm knew accountability could not end with two employees. A company did not change because two people faced consequences. It changed when the system stopped rewarding the behavior that created them. Before boarding, Malcolm turned toward the passengers who had waited through the delay. Some recognized him now. Others had learned his identity only after the operational hold began. I owe you an explanation, he said. The gate area became quiet. Today, this airline stopped flying because we could not prove that every required inspection had been properly verified. That decision disrupted your plans. It cost time, money, missed meetings, and missed connections. I am sorry for that disruption. But I will never apologize for choosing certainty over convenience when your safety is involved. A passenger from row 3 called out. You did the right thing. Malcolm nodded, but his expression remained serious. Doing the right thing should not require knowing who is speaking. That is what today taught us. He looked toward Naomi and Ethan. A junior employee should be heard when the facts support her. A young technician should be heard when his records reveal a problem. And a passenger should not have to prove wealth, status, or authority before being treated with dignity. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, emotional but composed. Malcolm continued. Safety begins when we stop deciding who deserves to be heard before they even speak. Then he picked up his carry-on and walked on a Flight 417. This time, nobody questioned his seat. Nobody examined his clothes. Nobody asked why he understood the aircraft. Malcolm returned to seat 2C and looked through the window as another Apex Meridian jet lifted into the evening sky after completing its verification. His father's words returned to him one final time. Never let another person's suspicion decide your worth. Malcolm had not. But he had learned something larger that day. Power was not proving that he belonged in first class. Power was making sure the next person would not need to own the airline to be believed. Hours earlier, they had tried to silence one man because of how they saw him. By sunset, an entire company had been forced to examine what it had refused to see. And when Flight 417 finally left the ground, Apex Meridian was carrying more than passengers. It was carrying a promise that dignity would no longer depend on a title, and that no warning would ever again be ignored because someone had already decided the person speaking did not matter.